Newsfirst, Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.
And a wonderful morning to you. This is Newsline, live as always from the Newsfirst studios in Dawson Street in Colombo. And folks, out there, slightly wet day. Need to watch out, be a bit careful, especially when you're braking. Check your tires and all that for your motorists. Sri Lanka continues on its spiral into a debt trap. That seems to be virtually the talk of the town. With the increasing national debt levels, there's something else happening down at the bottom end of the financing pyramid, and that's called the microfinance market. It's causing great consternation, and we receive several messages from members of the public about that sector. Now, to discuss finance, banking, and all things related is that veteran banker who's right here with us in the studio, Mr. Rajendra Theagarajah. Very good morning, Mr. Theagarajah.
Good morning to you, Faraz.
Thank you very much for being on the program.
Always a pleasure.
I see that after your various stints in the banking world, you've ditched the tie.
With great anticipation.
Do you feel freer now?
I enjoy myself thoroughly.
Indeed.
Yes,
Mr. Theagarajah, we are constantly reminded now by politicians from both sides of that divide that Sri Lanka is in a spiraling and ever-increasing debt, and some call it a debt trap. But also, it's beginning to now become clear that the bottom end of this pyramid, right at the end, in the microfinance world, interest rates are high, there is irresponsible lending, and causing all sorts of problems, including social problems. How true is this, and how bad is the problem?
So that to give it the correct perspective, let's not splash the brush across the entire spectrum to understand this industry. You have 3 to 4 pillars in this microfinance ecosystem. On one hand, you have the consumption-based spending, which doesn't really have an economic activity, like white goods. Then you have in the agri where there is a need for micro financing, and then you have the urban and semi-urban entrepreneur-led requirements for microfinance. For example, like the guys in the Gulf years, the food traders, the nanas of this world, who also when they started needed this sort of financing. And you have a series of providers which includes the organized sector like the banks and the non-bank financial sector. But then as you go greatly more deeper into the space, more rural, you have another ecosystem of NGOs and also players who are not organized, not in the organized sector.
So unregulated?
Yeah. And I think that is where probably most of these issues come in. And if I bring to your attention some of the recent news about what has been happening in the north and the south, the east, which caught a lot of attention. I think a lot of that happened, I think, post 2009, when 2 or 3 of those districts were newly open. You had people who rushed into those areas, both from the formal and informal sector. Formal sector, yes, there was a need because of the agri-based stuff, it was done. But you also had players from the informal sector who went in there and were pushing things like white goods, television, various things. And to a great extent, you had people who had never seen this sort of thing, even making to believe that they were grants, they were given free of charge.
Oh, really?
And very often they would sign a piece of paper not knowing what they were signing, and after 18 months or 24 months, when there was no payment, and you have a debt collector coming in and knocking at the village, They wake up and wonder, but I thought I got it, it was given to me. So that was on one end of the spectrum. And for most of those, I think consumer driven, the rates have been pretty high. But in fairness to the organized sector, especially on the agri and the dairy space, most of the micro credits are supported by organized refinance schemes. We have two clusters of financing which are administered by the central bank. One is what we call the refinance schemes, which typically get lent at around 6–6.5%. For eligible borrowers, and then you have some which are called the interest subsidy based schemes, where the Ministry of Finance or a particular ministry will administer a particular percentage of interest as a rebate to the lending bank, whereas the bank lends a certain amount to these small timers based on their own funds. There again, the rates are realistic.
How realistic is realistic?
I would say these are all structured programs. So if you have, say, a 6% interest rebate given, and the bank's own cost of funds perhaps is another, maybe, I don't know, 6 to 10%. The range, the lending range could be anything from, say, 12 to 15% in that space. In that space. Then you also have lending in micro, which does not come under any of these schemes, where you have banks and non-bank institutions, regulated institutions, who believe in a particular sector, are willing to take the risk out of their own money, depositors' money, they will lend. Now when they do that, there is a cost of financing in terms of deposits. Then there is a cost of administering, the cost of distribution from Colombo or wherever it is to the village, the cost of surveillance and recovery, and there is also a premium which one has to put for the risk profile of the borrower. So there is no way can a regulated formal institution give that sort of customer or borrower funds at 3 to 4% markup over their cost of funds. It definitely will be more.
And so what are we talking about?
So I would say within the regulated industry, for what I call entrepreneur-oriented micro-lending, the rate space should be, I would say, anything between 18 to 22%, what I think is a fair...
Is that a fair sort of percentage, taking into account the cost of finance, the cost of admin, cost of distribution, cost of surveillance and recovery, and the cost of addressing the risk profile? Certainly in
the space which I operate currently, which is a value-center driven group and a bank, it's within that space, that sort of price range, right? But then you also have people who are pushing, as I said, a non-economic activity driven consumer-based loans, and call them micro, but they're also micro. Micro, if it's 50,000 in terms of value, it's not fair, because to price it at the same price, they may lend it at 30–35%. But again, they are taking a risk because these are non-collateralized.
So even these other ones, which at 18 to 22, the NGOs and the but unregulated firms, you said informal sector can...
The claims are based on publicly available reports that they are going even as high as 35 or 40%. I'm not involved in that sector, but these are reports. And it's probably because of the cost structures of those institutions or bodies which are going and doing this. But one has to also take this in a slightly different perspective. As you go from urban Colombo to semi-urban to a deep village, the cost of reaching these people who have, still you have parts of Sri Lanka which are not included in the formal banking and financial system. For them to have access to a decent credit It's nearly impossible in some of those areas.
Yeah.
So when a person in the informal sector goes in there, there is a tremendous amount of risk he or she is naturally taking, which has to be reflected in the price they put in.
I see. Now, there is great concern that the central bank takes the easy way out by saying, well, you know, that one sector we don't know about that because we don't regulate that. Now, it's the same sort of thing that happened to payday lender in the United Kingdom, Wonga, and they were not regulated by the Financial Services Authority, the FSA. But the FSA in Britain stepped in when they looked at the wider picture of the finance industry in a wide perspective. And they stepped in and they forced Wonga to return significant amounts of monies and write it off and so on and so forth. But they did so because in the interest of the wider financial market, the stability of the financial system there. Now, in Sri Lanka, we've had our business sections of the newspapers is littered with such events where so-called finance companies have gone down, and only later for the central bank to then announce and say, well, actually, they were not deposit taking, and anyway, we don't regulate them. I don't want to mention names, but there are remarkable cases. In one instance, the loss was over what even overtook the bond matter. And then, thereafter, the central bank steps in and tries to administer everything. And then we find out, the public are told that some of the money earmarked for other things like national development and so on is being given to these, is virtually being given to these depositors, at least part of it. I think in one instance the central bank stepped in and oversaw a program where those customers, I can't call them depositors because they were not, got 41%, or they were promised 41%, God knows if it's all paid or not. And many such instances. Now we have, I saw it online, some firm that's just sort of opened its web doors for business here. The interest rates are calculated. They're only short term, but if you look at it on an annual basis, it comes to around 365%, which is a lot of money. And yet, the central bank says they're not regulated. Advertisements are being carried out all over the place. So why have the central bank and why have this monitoring unit if they are not being able to play a part?
So I think we need to look at this from two perspectives. First is the role of the central bank in monitoring and surveilling those institutions for which they have given a license to accept deposits, public deposits, and do on lending. That's a very important role the central bank has. The second thing is the role the central bank has in continuously disseminating public information to the public about the list of accredited institutions whom they accredit as proper institutions for which the general public are advised to place their deposits. Now, beyond that, there is also been, I think, in fairness to the regulator over the last few years, increasing efforts taken through public media, social media, as well as print media, to make public aware of some of these scams, such as some of the Ponzi scams and various attempts by unorganized groups to approach innocent consumers and increase the awareness. But what you and I have to understand for us is eventually it is the ultimate, the responsibilities that of the individual person who goes into an institution, however tempting it is, and places his or her money. And when they do that, if somebody says, I'm giving you 20% for 12 months interest, and there is enough public
Thea, this works. What you just said works in the urban areas where perhaps the financial literacy is at a different level to what it is out there within the rural masses. And especially, I don't want to even say especially, you know, in the north and the northeast, let's say the former conflict areas, there was a 30-year plus divide, if you like. And they were left behind, if you like, in a time warp, right? And 30 years later, end of the war, the economy in those areas and the rest of the country just went from here to all the way up. The financial literacy out there is not as robust as we would like it to be, and therefore it's essential that bankers such as yourself, senior bankers, actually do not remain silent, but be vociferous in the need for regulation. Because at the end of the day, if I may say so, Mr. Theagarajah, silence in this case is damaging to our country, to our economy.
I cannot agree with you, Mohan. That's why I think the Microfinance Act has now come into play, hopefully with the, it's still early days, but with the intent of netting those institutions which are in the space of microfinance, which are not formally covered by the central bank. So you now have another ecosystem which was in play, but which now comes under a different net. And now it's up to the regulator to make sure that between these two nets there is no crack, to make sure that, because under the Microfinance Act as well, those who are not licensed to take public deposits, but who are in the space of lending to these marginalized or the small ticket players have to register, whether it's an NGO or not. So once you register, then there is a framework, hopefully, of proper surveillance and reporting back. Now, for example, as a banker or a NBFC, we have to report every month to the regulator the range of lending rates and deposit takes we have for each class of assets. So then they have an aggregation of the entire sector, which they monitor, and when the governor meets the CEOs on a monthly basis, if there is a spike or a variation, that is discussed, because they have information based on self-reporting by the participants. And hopefully with the new introduction of the Microfinance Act, I hope a similar form of surveillance will prevail on that sector, which will also increase the pressure of self-regulation and better governance in how these people approach the common person.
In Britain, I mean, it's the same in the States and everywhere else. You can't be raising money if you're not licensed to do that. You can't even give financial advice if you're not licensed to do that. But over here, we find all sorts of things. It starts with the C2. There are no, if somebody, that's another, in a way, a sort of a pyramid, a Ponzi scheme, in a way.
Let me tell you, Faraz, I think we need to correct each other. I think it's not fair to say that that doesn't happen in England or the States. It does,
but there's regulation. In every market. But it happens, but there's regulation. That's what I'm trying to say. Wonga didn't get away with it. And we have the same. Wonga, Sri Lanka is happening as we speak. And there are people who are being sent messages, because obviously the ownership of telephones in this country is tremendously high. And the digital divide in terms of the telecoms, there's hardly a gap. The country is virtually full of signals and so on. So it's very easy to market.
So there are 2 points. First thing, I think when you say Wonga didn't get away with it, Wongas, when they started,
Yeah.
they did the same thing, they got away with it, but eventually surveillance caught up.
Yeah.
And I think that's a progressively evolving phenomena worldwide with regulators.
So do we have to wait for several more
No, but
golden keys to happen in this country?
No, I don't think so, but I think in fairness one needs to give the benefit
Yeah.
to also those who are in regulation
Yeah.
to build up their capacity. And you just mentioned about the involvement of telcos as well as SMS and other
Yeah.
means of technology in reaching out to innocent people.
Yeah.
But now we have an opportunity for increased cooperation between regulators who are regulating money lending activities and those who are regulating telcos
Yeah.
to increase their cooperation, exchange of information, and to make sure that this sort of thing does not happen.
Now, yeah, I contacted the central bank about one of these let's call them payday loan operators. They operate online, and I'm not going to give them any benefit of any sort of plug by mentioning their name, but they're out there and it's available on the internet. I asked the central bank, and they said, well, we don't regulate them, they're out of the regulation. Why? Because, oh well, they don't take deposits, really. Now, this country has got a my point is this, don't want to drag you down there, but there's a lot of black money, and if you are not regulated, and if you can just start a business and say, this is Banda and Co, we lend money, and you know, we lend money at 10% a day or 10% a week, if you want to come and get it. It is a wonderful way for these guys to launder their money. It's a one big laundry going on here, you know, and so where is the regulation? We've got.
So I think there is also, while regulation is prevalent and regulation is evolving, hopefully continuously to get stronger,
Yeah.
I think there is also a role for people like you and me, members of the general public, when we become aware of these sort of schemes, to blow the whistle, right? If you believe, and if we believe that there is somebody offering this sort of thing at 300% on an annual equivalent basis,
Yeah.
I think we also have a responsibility to bring this to the attention of those in regulation and say, in case it had escaped.
Well, that's why we do it. That's why
Okay.
that's why the governor gets calls from us and say, excuse me, what are you doing about this?
But then I think there is an opportunity and a need for that sort of public outcry and lobbying to continuously be put in, so that there is pressure put on those in regulation.
But you see, Mr. Theagarajah, if you see our concern about regulators and regulations, when we see that the regulator failed miserably when it came to the bond scam, right? And I'm sorry to keep going on about it, and I keep rabbiting on about it, because it is the significant, the greatest scam ever to afflict our country, and unfortunately it's there. Then we had, in the past, we had the pumping and dumping business going on, and it was all false. We were living in some false paradise, right, where our stock exchange was supposed to be the best performing in the world, and all that business. And then it's only to find out that a few individuals. So the regulator was asleep. And it appears to me now that the regulator is once again in some deep Rip Van Winkle sort of style slumber. Are we waiting for several more scams before they can take action?
But that's why we have people like yourself who are in the game, in the radar, who are continuously asking these questions and hopefully putting the right sort of pressure on regulation. I think it takes not two but also three to tango. The general public also have a role.
No, we can't keep blaming the public on everything.
No, it's not about public, but the responsibility of the public.
Yeah. But shouldn't banks like yourselves get more involved further down that?
So let me tell you, the reason I removed this tie 3 years ago is
Yeah.
I am now involved in a group which is into financial services, but which is right in the middle of financial services from what we say field to fork in the value chain. So when you say getting deeply involved, I think I understand the mindset of a farmer as good as anybody else today in terms of structuring requirements, and that's why I will never complain and say I cannot lend to that sector, because wherever possible.
Does your bank do
very much so
on non-collateralized loans?
Very much so. But what we do is how we take protection, because we also are dependent on public deposits. What we do is, as much as possible, it's not about calling a farmer and lending, giving him some money, to make sure that that money is put towards the actual cultivation or a requirement, and hopefully link that farmer's output through the supply chain so that he has a fair price for his produce, because only if you have a fair price and a market can you repay the bank. So once you look at the access to market, the only two possible risks you take is, one is climate risk, and secondly key man risk, in case that farmer succumbs to death. And those two are covered through insurance. And I think if one focuses on that supply chain and make sure that these farmers, genuine farmers or entrepreneurs, have a very clear access to the market through Colombo as well as urban businesses, and I think that's a role for every bank to do. The incidences of non-performance actually can be significantly reduced. That value chain financing, but you need to understand that and spend time and have a passion for that.
Indeed. Now, as we lobby everyone that needs to be lobbied for and on behalf of the people, for regulation and for responsible lending, and for rates that are that can be sustainable from both sides. As we do all this, can we ask you, towards the end of this program now, what would be a fair rate sector, non-consumption based?
So I will tell you what we do in the space I operate in, with the institution I operate in. It would be anything between 18 to 22%. Right, and that is a reflection, having taken into account my institution's cost of mobilizing financing, placing a fair risk for a premium for the risk take in terms of the non-collateralization, as well as the cost of distribution reaching out to that sector.
What would be your ideal scenario? Would you like the government to have legislation that prohibits anyone from lending money, whether or not they take deposits, so that they can control it from the bottom upwards?
If I read you correctly, I think I'm talking about interest rate ceilings.
Well, yes, and also not only interest rate ceilings, but if you want to set up in business where part of your business is lending money in any shape or form, you need to be registered with some regulator that's overseen by the government.
Yes, so I don't think it's only focused on the central bank, but I think from a government's perspective, I fully empathize with you or agree with you that there should be policy in place that anybody who is taking public money on one side and giving it to another part of society as lending should be registered and should be regulated. I fully agree with you.
Rajendra Theagarajah, do you know what? We've come to the end of our time allocated, but we do hope that you will continue to play a dynamic role in this very invaluable sector, and also out there in the rural areas. People are actually voting for people like you. Not quite literally voting, but they're supporting people like you, because there is an urgent need to regulate what's going on down there. If we as a network can do anything to help, our doors are wide open. Thank you very much, and we wish you very well in all your efforts. And
thank you very much for us, and as always, it's a pleasure to be here in the studio and have this chat.
Thank you, and that's the way it was. And we're finishing on time today, believe it or not. So thank you very much. And that's the way it was on Newsline on the 16th of August 2018, which is a Thursday. Take care. God bless.
News First, Newsline with Faraz Shauketaly.